So it's always a big pleasure to speak in a room with a lot of VIPs in there, especially as a junior researcher, as a first experience. It gives not only anxiety to that, but also special meaning, especially at the anniversary. So in that respect, a little bit of disclaimer. For this presentation, we are going to depart a little bit from the usual tradition, because usually we would present the research which we have already published before. In that case, in this case, we are going to show instead the research which was not yet published. Well, there are two reasons for that. First of all, it's because it's more exciting for me as a person who speaks, but also it should be more exciting for the audience, right? Because we know how loyal the wiiw audience is, and we are pretty much sure that you did your homework and you read our latest policy note on the war in Ukraine and the forecast report, right? You did it. So, and if you did, then you should probably know that it is actually quite a big of a challenge to estimate the level of economic activity and its downturn in the wartime. The reason for that is very simple. People from finance will probably relate to that. It's a low frequency, high impact event, and you lack data. Because if you want to make a decision as a policymaker and you're waiting for the GDP figure, well, you have to wait for 3 months. Sorry for that, and maybe a little bit longer for the revision. So, and you needed to make the decision already yesterday. So what can you do? Well, the answer for this is you have to make some assumptions, and assumptions differ, and that's why when you look at the range of estimates, well, they vary quite a lot. So if you look, for instance, Ukraine, minus 30% year on year, expected for this year by EBRD, minus 45% by the World Bank, minus 38% by wiiw. It's, of course, the best estimate. Just telling you. And that's not, this, 15 percentage points. That's, there's a whole world, right? Europe has never seen such, even the difference in the estimate, 15 percentage point decline. Developed Europe have never seen that in the last, 15, 20 years. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is not that the economists are stupid or that they are not smart enough. There are a lot of very smart people working on those problems. The issue is that you don't have proper tools. Right? You don't have data to work with, so you have to make clever assumptions. And there are different approaches. You can base your estimations based on the exposure of some assets or some of the economic activity. For instance, you look at the map of Ukraine, you see how much was occupied by the Russian armed forces, you deduct this from the total GDP, and this is effectively your estimate. Is it reasonable? Yeah, to a certain extent, right? It has an argument behind this. You can also go historical way. You can say, hey, look, there was an Iraqi war, also interstate conflict. The first year GDP drop was about 37%, somewhat comparable intensity of fight. So maybe we should take that as a benchmark. This is one way of doing things, right? And you can also do the modeling, which is effectively like the combination of two things with a little bit more fancy equations behind that. But all of them are still prone to the same type of problems. Well, you have to imagine things. Let's put it this way. And I'm not that good at imagining things. I like to look at things. So what I want to show you is one of the least conventional ways, but which is getting the mainstream movement in the economics of how you can try to evaluate the economic impact of the wartime regions using satellite data. For that, what we do, we take a map of Ukraine and we map the luminosity of those areas, just which we collect from the satellites. Every time you go to sleep or whenever you do your yet another report to deliver for the deadline or some more exciting activities at night, all of that is recorded by the satellites which are going across Earth, having the infrared sensor capturing all the photons which are emitted from the surface area of our planet. Now, there are a few things which you can draw from this picture already. For instance, the level of concentration of the brightness. It's very much concentrated around the major urban areas, and this is highlighting how much urban our economies are. So that is a meaningful comparison. But what we are most interested in is how it evolved over time, in particular with respect to the wartime situation. And what we just do, let's look at the luminosity, not in March 2021, what you see at the moment, but in the next year. And you probably don't need to have a PhD in economics to make a conclusion that this is a disaster. You see that a lot of areas got dark almost completely, including some of the remote regions of Ukraine. To make it a little bit more colorful and maybe more visually clear, let's use what this data allows us to do. You can take the value of each of those pixels, which reflects the radiance, effectively the brightness of each of those pixels, and deduct it from each other, right? So we deduct the value of the March 2021 from the base value, which is what you see right at the moment. And let's color those pixels, which are negative ones, so where you had the decline in luminosity with red or pink, and the ones where you had the increase with light blue. Well, I guess it tells you a story, right? And there are a few things to tell you about this, and a few things to keep in mind when interpreting those pictures. But before we do this, let's look at some of those cities. Let's try to get closer to the numbers to make sure what is the scale, because even though we see the colors, right, the colors do not reflect how big was the decline in comparison. So let's do this. Let's take March 2021 as the benchmark year, and let's divide the value of March 2022 over that value. So this is what you will get at the beginning, right? You have the 100%. The bars which are colored red, these are Russian-controlled cities, or cities controlled by Russia before the start of the war. And there is the yellow bar which shows you the value for Ukraine. And let's have a look how it changed. So here it is, right? We can have a few conclusions. So we are looking just at the 15th most populated cities of Ukraine. And there are a few conclusions that we can make. Let's first look at the Ukraine. We have the ratio of 23%. So the luminosity, the brightness of the area of Ukraine over the year declined by, well, how that would be, 77%, I guess, right? This is massive. This is comparable to the decline in wages in Donetsk and Luhansk separatist-controlled areas during the conflict of 2014 and 2015. The difference is, though, that separatist-controlled regions were all affected by the armed conflict. When we speak about Ukraine, even though the country was affected, but there was a different extent to which physical damage occurred to the regions. There were regions which were close to the ground operations of the Russian armed forces, and there were those which were very remote, like Lviv. And what we see is that, indeed, in Lviv and Vinnytsia, we have a more moderate decline, only by about 40%, just by 40%, right? But we also have a few cities like Dnipro and Kryvyi Rih, where the decline was much more massive, even though there were no ground operations by the Russian troops. And it's important to keep in mind, we will come to that later and explain why this happened and what's behind this. But before that, let's talk a little bit about the data and how careful you have to be before you interpret the results. So if you look carefully at the map, what you will find out is that there are a few areas which are recording some, well, unusual, one could say, increase in economic activity. And for those people who know a little bit how the events unfolded in March, they would identify that those were the areas of the strong armed conflict ongoing, and those were the ground operations. Now, we can zoom in a little bit to all of those, and people who followed the events also will recognize that, for instance, this sparks near Kiev. This is the direction from which Russian armed forces went to Kiev through the cities of Irpin, Bucha, and Hostomel. So these fires that you see, the increase of lights, this is not because some people suddenly started to make business. It's because there were fires in the areas and explosions. Pretty much similar story is for Chernihiv, which got less attention, but apparently had very severe fires on the north of the city. And Kharkiv, which had some dramatic things happening. Thanks to YouTube, you can even find and identify those things from the ground. So, for instance, this is one of the fires which were not extinguished by the local emergency teams just because it was dangerous for their life to get through. So the takeaway here is that not all the fires are born by the economic activity, and you have to be careful in selecting those. And one of the ways how you can do this, to exclude those outliers, because those fires are usually very bright and very strong, much higher than the usual median values. So for that reason, when you do the comparisons, it's more useful to compare not the averages, but the means. Oh, sorry, not the averages, but the medians. The median is the value which separates your distribution in two equal parts. And it is less susceptible to the outliers which can skew your results heavily. So, coming back to the issue, why in Dnipro and Kryvyi Rih, where we didn't have a lot of fatalities, this map shows exactly that, so the big circles show the big amount of fatalities over Ukraine, and the small bubbles show a relatively small level. And you see that, for instance, in Dnipro, there was little of that happening. It's because in the cities, the curfew was introduced. When there is an air attack, you have to go to the basement, you have to shut down all of your utilities, and well, effectively you have to stay impaired, like severely impaired in your mobility options. You live on the subsistency level until the air raid is over and you can go back. And this is what we see. So the decline in Dnipro is in a way the reflection that people were actually quite careful in fulfilling their duties as citizens and taking their safety carefully. Another thing is, of course, that some people were running away, so there is some migration implied in this decline of luminosity. But the main takeaway here is that even if the ground operations are not touching you, it doesn't mean that your economic activity will not be impaired. A credible threat is as powerful as its execution. Even one missile could launch a shutdown of your economy for a few hours. And we know that even from the COVID experience, where we had no bombs dropping on the European states, but we had a massive drop in production. So this is one of the lessons to keep in mind. Now, the second one, we can also check the distribution of the values for the government-controlled areas of Ukraine and those which are newly occupied territories. So you see the bars, the pink values, they show you how much value loss, how much luminosity drop was, and the solid blue bars tell you how much remained. And the scale is somewhat different considering the uncertainty about the numbers, even though you see that in the newly occupied territories, the median values are actually somewhat higher. Now, what these numbers don't tell you is the nature of the destruction, right? Because what you see in the government-controlled areas of Ukraine, this is the destruction which you can relatively easily recover, right? Those were, to a large extent, areas, for instance, in Lviv, where people just ran away, shut down, were sitting in the basement, so it can recover quickly. But if we look at the newly occupied territories, these are the places, to a large extent, like Mariupol, where the utilities sectors, where a large part of infrastructures, where the large part of residents were completely shut down and destroyed. That means that the recovery would be much longer, heavier, and much more costly. And this is, again, one caveat to keep in mind when you try to interpret the numbers. And, you know, while listening to all the people with the PhD titles when they give you a fancy presentation. Okay, so one thing that is important to note, and here we're coming to the direction of the future research, which I find exciting, is to think about the reconstruction of the region. Well, eventually it should come to that, I hope at least. So, and there are several caveats to keep in mind. Well, first of all, remember that this economic activity is very much clamped up together. And that's because our economies, they're effectively networked, right? We economists, we usually draw these curves of supply and demand curves, right? And we think about sometimes atomic agent. When it comes to restoration, it's not the best metaphor. You better think about this as networks. And they have their own structures. They have their own peculiarities. I want to focus on one particular issue, and that is the issue of the fact that networks have multiple layers. So the network that you see on the left, these are the networks of the roads. The next one, this is the network of the grids, the electrical grids that are supplying and giving energy to the economy. They are important. They are connected with each other because electricity gives supply of energy to many other utility systems, such as water, waste, and sometimes even heating. And that has implications for the way how you want to restore the most critical elements of your infrastructure. When you look at the networks, you might think of different types of, networks. How many? 3 minutes. Okay, good. So some of them are extremely centralized, and usually when we think about the degree of importance of particular nodes, we think that the nodes which have most of the connections are the most important ones. Well, because you connect to many things, so if you remove that from the system, it collapses. Just an example, look at the look at the part which shows you the centralized network and remove the green node. It will collapse. There will be no network. They will just isolated objects. And it usually seems that the distributed networks, shown on the right, they are most resilient ones. And this is what we see on the, for instance, on the electrical grid of Ukraine. Now, the thing is that this, even though this is true, this might be misleading if you do not take into account the capacities of the nodes to provide and transmit energy. Because, again, we have multi-layered networks, and they have limited ways of transmitting and supplying. We know it from the war in Donbas, where, for instance, in the water provision system, Voda Donbassa, was mostly damaged and had disruptions not because of the direct damage to the water supply network, but to the electrical grid. And to make the last lesson out of it, just give you an example. Imagine a network where you have 4 generators, right? And they are loaded to 80%. And the network is operating as long as they're all below 100. If it is going above 100, then you have to resupply, or it burns down or shuts down. Imagine there is a damage to the left node, where you have 80%, and you have to redistribute, right? So on the left-hand side, you have 0, and you redistribute equally to the connected nodes. You get 120 above and below. Now again, they are overloaded above 100%, so you need to redistribute again. And you do this at the expense of the last node, but it's now overloaded with 105%. So it shuts down, and effectively you need to redistribute again this 105, and you have the whole collapse of the network. So the main takeaway here is, it's not just about centrality of the nodes or a particular generator that is connected. Yeah? It's not just about the connections it has, but it's also about the capacity it has to deliver. And that's why when you as a policymaker want to restore the region, especially in the sector of utilities, you have to consider the trade-off which emerges from that. It's the trade-off between centrality and capacity that it gives. And those are effectively the 4 lessons which are driven by this presentation. First, the luminosity decline is comparable to that of Donbas in the separatist-controlled areas, which were most severely hit. The credible threat is as powerful as its execution in the armed conflict. The utilities networks are nested, and you should prioritize reconstruction of the nodes with the highest centrality capacity levels, not just centrality. And the final one, well, don't trust data boldly. You need some clever people to interpret it. Maybe not me, but at least some people at this table. Thank you very much.